Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Check out Locals for updates and continued support keeps this channel going. And thanks to the supporters that we have already. So today we're going to talk about China. We've spent in our roundtables a lot of time talking about Ukraine and Russia, and that's where the real hot war is going on right now. But right now, China apparently is biding its time. But it's really what we see when we see what China does next is, I think, going to be the real indication of where things are going to go. Because if we look at the Russia-China partnership, China is clearly the senior partner. China has the manpower resources, the tech resources, the military resources, even though it's technically the third largest military after Russia, which is number 2. It has the potential to be the world's largest military in a total war scenario with this industrial output. But so we can divide China into like 2 categories: the long game that China's playing, and then the short game. So the long game is what China plans to do with their 100-year century strategy. And then there's the short game of what China's going to do in, say, the South Pacific, South China Sea, Taiwan, Philippines, the disputed islands, and all that. I think a brief history lesson is in order, though. The idea that China is a rising power should really be no surprise to anyone, because for the last 3,000 years, China was the dominant power in East Asia. The fact that Japan and the Western powers were dominant in that area, say in the 19th and 20th centuries, was really just a fluke. It was an accident in the overall history of East Asia. China is always going to be the dominant power in East Asia, so that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. The Chinese interests historically have been a lot like Russia's. If anybody remembers Keith and I's Russia's geopolitics stream, between the 2 rivers, that's where the main Chinese culture is. But they're not really defensible. You have to expand to create buffers. And so south, there's the jungles of Indochina. Southwest and west, there's the Himalayas. And up north, you just want to push into Siberia. And so China has this drive to push away from the 2 rivers in order to create buffer states for the core of China. But due to the century of humiliation by the Western powers in Japan, they were attacked by sea, which is for the first time where that threat was most pronounced, because historically it was on land and from the nomads of the steppe. And so now they have a strong incentive to build a naval program in order to defend their littoral regions and expand power into the Pacific to control trade and prevent a repeat of the century of humiliation. If we look at the modern Chinese government and system today, I think it most aligns itself with the historical trend of legalism, which is a kind of proto-totalitarian philosophy that developed in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC by the Qin dynasty. And it basically treats the state as God and uses all sorts of heavy-handed measures to strengthen the state. And that seems to be the kind of mentality that Xi is using. And throughout almost all of, from around 500 BC to 1500 AD, 2,000 years, the Silk Road was the dominant avenue of economic activity throughout the whole world. It was only with the rise of European sea power in the 15th and 16th centuries, by Europeans directly trading with Asian markets, that the Silk Road dried up and Central Asia became this backwater. It used to be, hub of commerce and empire. And Xi intentionally is trying to rebuild that. The Belt and Road policy projected to cost $1 trillion, but the Chinese are not playing for short-term profitability. It may not be profitable for decades, but that's not really the point. Xi wants to make Asia the economic center that it used to be, and which does 2 things. It makes China rich, because the Silk Road historically made China very wealthy, and also takes trade off the high seas, which means it doesn't have to compete with the Americans or the British or whoever the Western naval power of the jour is. And so this long-term reorienting can also be viewed within the context of the rise of Asia, which Japan indicated in the late 19th century. Now Japan was defeated by the United States. Japan was not as powerful as China is now, but we see what China showed us, was that an Asian power sufficiently organized along Western lines could begin to regain the age-old hegemony of East Asia. And China seems to be a continuation of that trend. We also see that the long-term strategy of China is to have naval dominance of their half of the Pacific. I mean, you could easily view what China's doing now as a reimagining of Japan's greater co-East Asia prosperity sphere, but instead of the Japanese doing it, it's China doing it. And to that end, they're going to be allied to Russia to guarantee access to the Central Asian republics. They're trying to make deals with the Taliban to get access to rare earth minerals like lithium in the Hindu Kush in order to corner the market on electronics. And they also are trying to build their own electronics industry to remove the ace in the hole that Taiwan has, because an invasion of Taiwan would lead to the destruction of the semiconductor industry. And so also becoming the world's workshop, which they've been doing for the last 25 years. And those are sort of like China's long-term strategic goals. Now, in the near term, what is China planning to do? I think China's waiting on seeing how the U.S. responds to Russia and how the Ukrainian conflict develops. Because if the United States takes a weak position, a dove position against the Russians, and that might encourage the Chinese to make more bold moves in their part of the world. If they take a harder stance against the Russians, then maybe they'll hold back. But also, if the West takes a hard stance against Russia, that will mean military assets are going to be shifted away from the Pacific, which might also encourage China to make a move on Taiwan. And, there are many different analysts that predict from sometime between now and 2030, China might invade Taiwan. And the question is, though, do they even need to invade Taiwan proper? Given that the annual tonnage of shipping production that China has is now not only achieved parity, but exceeds U.S. naval tonnage production annually, they might just be able to blockade Taiwan indefinitely and just say, starve them out. We see that for the first time with their Type 3 aircraft carrier, China has a carrier on par with the U.S. Ronald Reagan, which is a 100,000-ton aircraft carrier. So they are now capable of building super carriers, which is a total game changer. By 2050, they're predicted to have 10 carriers, of which I think probably the remaining 8 would be super carriers, which would give them complete control of their half of the Eastern Pacific, if they can get that far into those predictions hold. So I think what we can see in the short term is maybe a third or fourth Taiwan Strait crisis, where China decides to see how far they can push the Americans and the Taiwanese, and to see how they react to what's going on in Eastern Europe with the Ukraine. Keith, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's interesting how polarizing China is in terms of how people assess China's future. Because you have some people who say that China is the wave of the future. China is going to replace the West as the global center of global economic and political and military power. China is going to replace the United States as a global hegemon. That's a very common theme you hear in some circles, and you hear that from the left and the right. Usually, the further right they are, the more optimistic their view of China. And usually, the further left they are, the more optimistic their view of China. But then you also have a lot of naysayers when it comes to China as well. There are people who say, well, China is greatly overrated. Like you mentioned, Peter Zion, he calls China the Enron of nation states. He argues that it's really a house of cards, that their economy is basically a house of cards, and that they've got a lot of demographic and problems, as well as economic and problems and institutional problems, that he even predicts an eventual collapse of the Chinese state. Probably most analysts are somewhere in between those extremes. The thing about China, as far as China's military reach, at present, China still only has one military base outside the Chinese mainland, and that's in East Africa. So it's not like China is presently building some sort of extensive international military network like the United States has. The United States has hundreds of international military bases, whereas China has one. So that's they have a lot of catching up to do there. Also, China is very dependent on the United States for things like investment capital and as a client for international loans and things like that. Now, I've heard the argument made, well, if the United States ends up defaulting on its rather large at this point public debt, that China's going to be left holding the bag. But I don't know. I mean, how helpful is it generally to creditors when you have a debtor that just defaults. I mean, usually you just try to get what you can out of the remains, but that doesn't necessarily help you either. Um, like if you have let's say you have a debtor that owes you $1 million, and they say, sorry, I can't pay, I'll give you 10 grand. I mean, how much are you really gaining? So I do think that China, has some limitations in that regard. Um, I do think that this current situation with Ukraine is going to be somewhat decisive, because the impact of the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia in response has been to drive the Eastern countries closer together. In fact, I would argue from a strategic viewpoint, if I were an advisor to the leadership of any of the Western countries, I would say you made a big mistake by throwing the Russians off the SWIFT bank system, because what you're doing is you're strengthening the BRICS alliance. You're now giving them the incentive to create an entirely separate financial structure that covers the Eastern realm. So you've kind of shot yourself in the foot here. Um, and it's going to be interesting to see how well that continues. One thing about the relationship between China and Russia, though, is that Russia's taking a big gamble by doing what they're doing in a lot of ways. But one way is they're further indebting themselves to China. The Russians are essentially making themselves a financial dependency on China because of the actions they've taken in the Ukraine. Now, I guess they're thinking that it's going to pay off in the long run, because you have a number of other countries who've since moved eastward since all of this happened. India has pretty much taken Russia's side. Saudi Arabia, a long-term American client state, has even started looking more towards Russia. But if that happens, if the BRICS countries and other Asian countries start to develop, what amounts to a separate financial system, China is going to be the dominant player in that. The question is, how stable is China going to be over the long run, and what kind of liability are some of their partners going to be, and then what can China actually achieve in a military sense? One thing about China is that they don't really have much of a history of being successful imperialists. They've never really been able to extend much of a reach outside China itself, except for maybe in some of the surrounding areas. And even now, even though China is spreading all over the world in terms of its trade network, like I said, they still only have one military base. Now, maybe they feel they don't need it. Maybe their strategy is, well, economic dominance is what's going to work best for them. And there's already a revolt against that. I know in Africa now, you're actually starting to see anti-Chinese populism develop and anti-Chinese political parties develop. And I had a student a couple of years ago from Jamaica, and I was asking her if she could change anything about Jamaica. What would she want to change? And she said she'd kick the Chinese out. So, so the Chinese, I guess, are not. I guess they're doing the same thing as a lot of the Westerners. They're not exactly making themselves loved by a lot of people in their process of empire building. So we'll see how that goes in the future.
All right, Swithun.
Well, China is an interesting case. As to what it will do next. What I will begin with is just a brief overview of its sort of economic situation, which I think is going to play into this quite heavily. It's obviously the case that China is good, at least insofar as it's have a very, very good industrial base. It clearly runs a trade surplus and has done for many years, although to what extent that's down to currency manipulations is the question. But they certainly manufacture a lot of stuff. They've basically cornered the market in rare earth metals, etc. That's mostly due to the fact that the Americans have made it illegal for them to mine it. But it has been handy. So they have certain advantages there. And I'd say those are sort of primarily its economic ones. Although that said, its labor costs over the last 20 years or so have started to go up significantly, such that if you want something that's pretty low quality manufactured, you probably want to go to Cambodia, Vietnam, or Thailand instead, because they'll produce it more cheaply than the Chinese will. This is then related, I think you've been hinted before, as a demographic issue in China. China's population could well go down in the next year or two. Probably by 2030, it will start decreasing. Now, that interestingly relates, I'm jumping around here, to potentially then when they might go and try and take Taiwan, because they don't want to wait too long, because the number of troops they have might actually go down. Now, obviously, the population in China is so much bigger than Taiwan, that doesn't really matter, at least not yet. But the demographic issue is going to be a problem going forward if they want to project, become even bigger economically. If they want economic dominance, but they simply don't have that. Well, they do at present, but it's going down. The birth rate, obviously, the one-child policy, which has now been abolished. There's about, oh yeah, here we go. In 2020, this is an article from a couple of years ago. There's 24 million men of marriageable age who simply will not be able to get married because there's just not enough women to go around. So the amount of, barring the emergence of polyandry in China, which I think is somewhat unlikely, that's not going to do much for the birth rate. So the birth rate is going to be low for quite a long time. So what they will need to do is they will need to, economically speaking, they're going to want to be able to upskill their workforce so they can become a higher value manufacturer, because they can't keep the low costs as they have had historically. To what extent they can do that's another question. Peter Zine, who's mentioned before, seems to think that they can't, although I don't think that's entirely true. I mean, given the way, from what I hear about the Chinese education system, now, to be fair, though, the Chinese education system is still very much rote-based and very much, just follow the rules and you do well. But to a large extent, the Chinese students are somewhat more diligent and intelligent than most of the American ones and the British ones. So I wouldn't be too doubtful as to whether or not they could get to some sort of higher manufacturing level. Also in the favor of China's economy is they still have very high savings rates, significantly higher than the US and Western Europe, which gives them a lot of resources for investment. I think this is often missed by the naysayers of, oh no, China is just all going to collapse. It's like, no, they have significant savings rates, which do allow them to invest significantly more. That said, China has a massive debt issue. The real estate debt at the end of 2021 was exceeded 50% of GDP. And the total debt in China's economy is now like 290% of GDP. The real estate market in China accounts for 30% of their GDP in comparison to like 15 or 20% in other countries. They are very, very dependent on their domestic construction sector, which is basically fueled by lots of cheap credit, effectively. That clearly doesn't seem to be sustainable. They produced loads of them, but simply couldn't sell them. I mean, you may or may not I haven't heard about them for a while. The good old ghost cities where they just produce stuff and no one's there. So they have this massive sort of overproduction there. So they're clearly not using their resources particularly well. The question is, can they survive following that? Well, I mean, the West did. Also, the Chinese government's debt to GDP rate is only 45%, which in comparison to America's, I think is over 100%. The UK's is over 100% now as well. So proportionally, at least, the Chinese government could probably step in if they wanted to shore people up, and would probably be able to do it. Whereas the Western countries are probably increasingly less likely to be able to do that. So I think China's goal going forward is certainly they're going to try and get their birth rate back up, which is difficult. Apparently, there was a couple of Nanking professors in China who suggested that any family with less than 2 children should pay a subsidy to a procreation fund for other families of having more children, so increase the birth rate. But apparently, it didn't go down particularly well. As we've seen in the West in general, once the birth rate goes down, it's kind of difficult to get it back up. But they'll certainly be focusing on doing that. I think they'll focus on probably with a sensible education and the quality of manufacturing, continue the dominance in certain of the electronics, and also then eventually, yes, I think Taiwan. I don't know if this has been mentioned directly, but if China needs to export its goods, it's basically going to go past in the East China Sea, past around South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. Basically, South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan are basically outposts of America. So if they wanted to become somewhat independent of the US, they're going to have to try and get some more control over that region. But as Todd has mentioned, their navy is bigger and better than it has been historically. To what extent it's a sufficiently high size to be able to put military pressure elsewhere as well. I mean, so if he wants to get to, say, Western Europe, you've got to go down via Malaysia. So that they're kind of in an annoying position for that. So I do think eventually they would probably want to flex there to try and have some, maybe don't need to overseas military bases, but to flex some military strength there so they are not just going through an American sufferance. So I think those would be. Oh, and also I think Xi as well has mentioned this in the past, is that we're trying to move away to some extent from being solely an export-based economy and increase domestic consumption, which I think is possibly possible, because that would insulate China a little bit more from external global changes, and of course it would increase standard of living in China as well, because the Chinese consumer is harmed by the consistent manipulation yuan downwards because imports are significantly more expensive. So those are, I think, some relevant factors and some general thoughts as to where they may go in the near to medium term.
Okay, terminal philosophy.
Right. Well, as far as the military side of things, I would say that China's armed forces are still in a state of early development here. There are, very few battle-tested troops in the Chinese army. There have been, as you probably all know, like various border clashes between India and Tajikistan and things like that. But just as a broad overview, there are virtually no experienced officers in all of its military branches. If China is to attempt to somehow replace the U.S. as a hegemon, which I don't believe will happen, it has an extremely tall order to fulfill in terms of military, projecting military power. And first and foremost, China needs to create a navy, a blue water navy specifically. They have one aircraft carrier that is based off of a 1960s design that cannot go further than 500 miles from their own coastline. It's dependent on aircraft protection from the mainland. So this is, there's just like no contest here in terms of any sort of near future theoretical naval combat between the U.S. or something that could happen that could be perhaps more likely is a Japanese-Chinese naval showdown, depending on how China decides to project its power in the Pacific. But even then, Japan's navy is far more modernized, far more organized. They have far more vessels to deal with various situations, whereas there really isn't much of a Chinese navy to speak of. It just cannot compare at all to Japan or the United States. As far as the army goes, the army, I think there's a lot of problems facing the Chinese army, and there's a lot of interesting articles and books about this, but I think one thing that you can say just as a broad overview is that the Chinese army needs a formal modern doctrine. Based off of war games and some of the data that's come out of that, it seems to be clear that China doesn't know how to run a modern army, in the sense that during the Civil War between the nationalists and the communists, there were just these horrible human wave attacks that are very reminiscent of the Soviet Union in World War II, and so China has they just have a vulnerable army in the sense that they're very vulnerable to American cruise missile strikes from our Navy and Japan's allies and things like that. If certain logistics and infrastructure were crippled by cruise missiles, that kind of decapitates a modern army. If you don't have various radar stations and intelligence infrastructure working and all firing at once to sort of dictate large movements of infantry and armored divisions. They are just highly vulnerable to cruise missile attacks that they don't have much against. Now, yes, of course, they developed a hypersonic missile, which travels very fast, but that would only work in attempts to, I guess you could say, counter U.S. naval presence. But given the sheer amount of, for example, Tomahawk cruise missiles that we have, it would be in several hours if something were to happen, a theoretical war were to happen. A lot of China would also go, the electricity would go out just because there's tons of electrical grid infrastructural problems in China. And if any of that were even sort of slightly, at least based off of what I've read from the, I think it's from the Institute of the Cellular War, well, China is just in a very precarious logistical and infrastructure situation just in regards to the way they manage their military. And yes, there's also how China conducted itself in the Korean War, which it's again well documented, just inhumane human wave attacks. So they need to find a formal doctrine, and also if China were to lose many of its modern of its main battle tanks in several days or something like that, it would be much harder for them to replace their losses than it would be for the U.S. or U.S. allies. I mean, all the U.S. really has to do is sort of this soft power containment sort of a thing, and lean on our allies like Taiwan and Japan to retain some pressure on China. Now, I think personally, it would be while yes, China could potentially be this massive juggernaut of the military, I think currently it would be a bad idea that China attempts some sort of amphibious invasion of Taiwan, because again, they just do not have a battle-tested army. They have no, they're basically a lot of these results that came out of the war games that have happened in the last several years in China have just basically underscored that they don't know how to coordinate on these various levels between division, corps levels, battalion levels, and things like that. And so it's still sort of finding itself in that regard. One last comment here is that, and it's a bit of a cliche to say this now, but I think it's true regardless, is that China will not become a hegemon simply because of its demographic problems. Well, it's sort of twofold. Its demographic problems and its financial problems. Peter Zion, as we've discussed in the past, basically does a really good job of highlighting just how bad their up and coming, or their soon to be disastrous demographic problem will be, where there's a sharp drop in population, a huge aging population, that they don't have any sort of public programs not in place to deal with, simply hundreds of millions of aging people. Also, there's an interesting statistic here that China's public debt exceeds 300% of its GDP, and its corporate debt is $27 trillion. So again, if China were to become a hegemon, you've just got an extremely tall order across several broad categories. Its ability to project military power, especially a blue water navy, if it wants access to these Western markets in places like the Persian Gulf, it has to figure out its enormous public debt problem. Yes, as Swithun pointed out, there is actually, they have, a good sort of public savings. However, the debt is quite abysmal, and then the corporate debt is something like $27 trillion based off of the 2021 article. So I'll just leave my opening comments at that.
Right. So again, for the short term, as far as Taiwan, in recent interviews and discussions, Peter Zion has been talking about the Russian population collapse, which is continuing from the collapse of the USSR, and that Putin had to invade Ukraine now because he wouldn't have the troops to do it 10 years from now, or whoever's in charge of Russia 10 years from now. So, and then Russia's goal was to get the 7 strategic bottleneck points to defend with its reduced population. Now, with that in mind, and with the fact that China's population is declining, and the fact that there are large amounts of the male population in China that can't find women, wouldn't that be a sufficient pressure for them to invade Taiwan early? It's like, look, we may not win, but the point is, if we don't invade now, we're never going to invade. And so what I'm thinking is, if we use the logic that Zion gives us about Russia, all of these like optimal characteristics about what China optimally ought to have. While certainly interesting and important in sort of contextualizing this whole thing, I think reduces the relevance of those perspectives. I mean, for example, there are plenty of wars throughout the 20th century which were engaged in where the people that were launching those wars were not optimally prepared. The Russian army, the Soviet army was not optimally prepared to invade Finland. It did it anyhow. It didn't matter that on paper it wasn't, it looked strong and powerful, but it wasn't really militarily ready. And so, China might be in a similar position. And the other thing is with the hypersonic missiles, the DF-17, the medium-range ballistic missile, Milley recently stated that the United States can't perform tests like the Chinese can. So China and Russia seem to have a missile edge over us on the tactical battlefield. And I think what's interesting, too, is if you look at the fact that the United States for 20 years has had the largest defense budget of any nation in the world, over $70 billion, we wasted it all on boondoggles. I mean, we had the Future Combat System, which was supposed to be an integrated shared chassis between tanks, armored fighting vehicles, and APCs. Didn't happen. There was supposed to be the stealth helicopter, the Comanche. Didn't happen. There was supposed to be the objective force and land force Warrior. Didn't happen. The F-35 is overpriced and it's over-delayed. There's very little practical application for the last 20 years of U.S. military R&D, whereas Russia and China both have super hypersonic missiles that we can't match yet. Russia has super cavitating torpedoes. China is allegedly working on a super cavitating submarine, which, I mean, if a submarine can go underwater at 700, 800 miles an hour, I mean, that's a game changer. And so they've been investing in practical military equipment. The other thing, too, is a lot of U.S. allies in the South Pacific are, of course, buying U.S. materials, so the F-35 fighter. There's a problem with U.S. doctrine here, right? With Boyd, the fighter, pilot from Korea, who then launched this revolt against the bomber mafia in the 70s to create the F-16, the A-10 Warthog, and all these specially tailored airframes. It's kind of been reversed now. We just have one airplane to do all the jobs, which is a recipe for disaster that never works in any combat situation. And if all of our U.S. allies are just going to use F-35s, and the Chinese still have specially tailored aircraft, that's going to give them at least airframe advantage. And furthermore, with the missiles and land-based aircraft at their disposal from the mainland of China, that's also going to come to play with Taiwan. So recently, for the last couple of years, they've been doing these, the game of chicken with Taiwanese air defense, where they keep on flying aircraft close around the clock, keeping them exhausted. The Chinese Air Force is like 10 times the size of the Taiwanese. So they can always keep a fraction of their Air Force in the sky to keep the Taiwanese air defenses exhausted. And much like how Russia did drills along the border with Ukraine and Belarus, to then, sort of get everybody into a lulled sense of security before they attacked, China could do a bunch of just drills, month on, month in, month out, month in, month out, and then they attack. And by that point, the Taiwanese are going to be exhausted from keeping up with this. So I think it's plausible that given the population constraints that we're talking about, and given the logic of Putin's actions in Ukraine, if Zion is correct, then we could see sooner than 2030 an attempt of China to invade Taiwan, not necessarily from the point of optimal control, but from the point of, well, if we don't do it now, we're never going to do it. And so I think the fact that they have a missile advantage, and as far as like ground forces, it's not like South Korea, Japan, or Taiwan have been in any conflicts, at least lately either. They're just as unbattle tested as the Chinese. And if you look at the Chinese actions in Vietnam, the last time they had a real military operation, which arguably was a strategic defeat because Vietnam still occupied Cambodia, you can say, though, that they've made massive improvements since then from these, peasant hordes that were fighting in northern Vietnam. They now seem to be able to engage in more modern military operations. Again, maybe not to the level of the United States, maybe not to the level of Japan, but that's where numbers can come in as a sort of equalizer. So a lot of analysts are predicting that some sort of Taiwan crisis, possibly an invasion, will happen between now and 2030. And I think that it might happen sooner rather than later based on demographic pressure within China, and broader events going on around the world, like, say, in Russia and the Ukraine and NATO and Europe. Keith.
Yeah, I think that one aspect of this war in Ukraine that's going to influence what happens in Asia is that I think China is probably hoping that the West is going to be distracted with what's going on in Ukraine and with Russia generally. And they're hoping that's going to perhaps create a move for China to become more aggressive towards Taiwan. In recent years, we've already seen efforts by China to exercise a greater level of control over Hong Kong. And I don't see why that would be any different as far as Taiwan either. As I think we were talking before the program, the Chinese have never been able to successfully expand eastward beyond the first island chain, which is basically the network of islands you see outside of China, Japan, and Taiwan, and all those places. And until they're able to do that, until they're able to expand past the first island chain, they're not really going to be able to become a power in the Pacific itself. Because the Chinese would like to be able to dominate a much larger section of the Pacific. They like to be able to exercise greater control over the Philippines, over Indonesia, over Malaysia, some of these places. And they do exercise a lot of economic influence there, but they're not really able to exercise a great deal of military influence because of the limitations imposed by the islands, the geographical borders that are there. And of course, that's China's only real access to water is their eastern region. They're landlocked on everywhere else. So that is important to China. Having water access is important. One way that the United States has become dominant in since the post-World War II era is because of its far-reaching naval power and the ability of the United States to dominate sea commerce. And for the Chinese to really rival the United States or the West generally, they're going to have to be able to exercise a great deal more sea power, as terminal philosophy was saying. But the first island chain is a barrier to that. And in particular, I think Taiwan really is something that they think is rightfully theirs anyway. So it wouldn't be surprising at all if they did make a move against Taiwan. I think they're kind of wondering, well, how much can they really push on that when it comes to their relationship to the United States. They're probably waiting to see what the United States does in Eastern Europe before they really make a decision as to what they're going to try to do with Taiwan. But I tend to agree with Todd. I wouldn't be surprised if the Chinese actually tried to make a move on Taiwan in sometime in the not too distant future. Another issue, though, in East Asia is going to be what Japan does. Japan is still, it's essentially a first world Western country. And it's possible for a revitalized Japan to emerge in the sense of exercising greater influence in the region as well, particularly as China becomes more powerful and more aggressive. There could be a pushback against China where you might see a lot of other countries in the region forming defensive alliances with each other. For example, some sort of Indo-Pacific alliance between, say, India and Japan, if China and India engage in any more clashes in the future, which they have. I mean, China and India have never historically really gotten along that well. It's just more of any cooperation between the two has been an alliance of convenience. All of those countries in the region, India, Pakistan, China, Russia, they all sort of work each other against the others. So that's a possibility as well. So it's possible that there could be a reemergence of some sort of Japan-led effort to try to contain China, particularly if the United States, the influence of the United States starts to recede. I don't think the United States is going to give up its hegemony in Asia voluntarily, though. In fact, in many ways, I think East Asia is probably more important to the United States than Europe is. I'm inclined to think that if the United States had to make a choice between giving up its dominance over Europe or giving up its dominance over East Asia, they would probably think East Asia is more important than Europe. At least that's my guess. So there's any number of routes it could go in the future.
All right, Swithun.
Yeah, I mean, from I agree with what Todd said. I mean, you've got 24 million Chinese men who aren't going to make any other Chinese soldiers for the future, so may as well send them into Taiwan. I mean, that's entirely possible. Possibly one of the major reasons why they might not take Taiwan directly, may try and go from an indirect route, is I understand that the worst case scenario, the Taiwanese destroy all their semiconductor factories, which now is now I can't remember exactly what industrial process semiconductors are used for, but I'm pretty sure that would significantly harm some of Chinese raw material exports, because nobody will have any of the technology to be able to utilize them. So whether that's going to be a good idea or not, I mean, ideally, I think for China's sense of national pride, and it does seem to be that China is very much a much more nationalistic country. Is officially communist, but in a sense, it's not really international communism. It's more like it's more like.
I was going to say Stalin socialism in one country.
Yeah, it's a socialism in one country, although it's not really Stalinist. It's sort of like a quasi state authoritarian nationalism that claims to be communism. So PR is important, and so maybe national pride will send them over the edge to do it. I suppose the ideal thing would be able to somehow sneak in and figure out how Taiwan make all the chips and make them in China and then invade. But from what I can gather, that isn't necessarily straightforward in any way. So that's going to be an issue. When it comes to China, I think I mentioned before, I don't know if they really do want to become a world power. I think they really just want to go back to their traditional spheres of influence in East Asia and be out of the reach of the Americans. I think that's really the goal. I don't think China. I think you mentioned naval power is interesting because China has never really been a naval power. I don't really think they've ever had that much interest in the world because, well, it's kind of hard to get to if you're not a seafaring nation. It's not like Britain. No, you just sail, go around the world because we can. And the Americans, to a large extent, inherited that. Keith mentions Japan. Japan is interesting because Japan have been remilitarizing over the last number of years or so. So they could be, they could potentially have an interesting response to China. Of course, they will only do what the Americans tell them at present. The question, of course, is, well, I mean, that's an interesting thing. I mean, we commented about the Chinese economy, which does seem to have lots and lots of debt, but so does the American economy. I mean, when Peter Zion complains, "Oh, the Chinese economy is kind of a joke," it's like I'm pretty sure the American economy is largely a joke as well. I mean, it's not as if we're comparing great, robust economies against the paper tiger of China. It's more of a case of whose is least bad. So I don't really think the American economy is in such brilliant shape in comparison to the Chinese economy, especially considering the only thing America exports is debt. What can we sell the rest of the world? US government bonds. Well, that's going to be fun when the yield rises. The Americans need to turn over, I believe, their national debt every 5 years. So if the interest rates start rising significantly in response to the inflation rate at present, that's going to make the financing of the US national debt significantly more expensive. This is where Britain has an advantage. Apparently, our debt only needs to be turned over every 13 years. So we'd be somewhat insulated from that, at least in the short term. So, yeah, I mean, the Chinese economy is seriously indebted and probably worse than it looks because the Americans lie, but the Chinese seem to lie more. Is probably my take there. So, I think they'd ideally, yeah, I think they probably would. It's not ideal, but I think is making a move in a shorter period of time is possible. But as Keith says, Ukraine is an interesting situation. Although no one will put, I severely doubt the West will put many sanctions on China for doing it because they can't afford to. This is something I remember I was going to say about China. One thing that China has an advantage over the West in, China seems to still believe that cheap, reliable energy is important, unlike the West and the US. They go, we want cheap electricity. Let's build coal power stations because they're kind of good and work. Whereas the West wants wind and solar, which, interesting, the Chinese will sell the parts for. So I think on an energy creation strategy, the Chinese actually have quite a big advantage. I think they'll also have more nuclear power stations as well. So that being something on energy basis going forward would be worth watching.
All right, terminal philosophy.
I think the only thing I'll add to the conversation here is that is just to kind of riff off of what you mentioned earlier about the possibility of a Taiwan or an invasion of Taiwan sometime between now and 2030. And I entirely agree with you that if it's going to happen, it's going to happen sooner or later. Only because if they don't, they're honestly, I mean, for one, the situation in Ukraine. Yes, you're right in the sense that China's waiting to see the broader U.S. response to that. And I think, however, if there were an attempt on Taiwan, I think the Chinese could definitely be victorious, but it would be something like a Pyrrhic victory. I could just see absurd losses both in their navy and their army because the Taiwanese population isn't going to. I have a hard time imagining they would just sort of bow down and accept, Chinese occupation without some cataclysmic fight to the death. So that could prove very costly for China. And, one thing that's interesting about modern militaries more broadly is that, in the global war of terror, as it is called, the United States, although it's, heavily kitted out with, modern military hardware and gadgetry and intelligence and all that, we never really found a good rhythm of dealing with insurgencies and sort of this asymmetric sort of warfare and this fourth generation of warfare, if you want to also refer to it as that as well. Yes, we could go toe to toe with some major world power and do tank division versus tank division, but this whole sort of insurgency where the insurgents won back in with the population. It's tough to say how well China would do with that in places like Taiwan and Taipei. So now would they just scorch earth the place and just and perhaps that would be very Chinese of them. But yeah, I do agree that if the invasion were to happen, it would have to happen sooner than later. But first and foremost, as Keith also mentioned too, they if they were to maintain some sort of global trade, they need to get past that first chain of islands and around Singapore and, along this whole route of getting to Western oil markets. I mean, they just have one enemy after the other. So, yeah, I think I'll just leave my closing comments at that.
All right. So, yeah, we'll be entering into the final statements. I think what I'll say is, and when it comes to the global population collapse that is being talked about by people like Peter Zion and others, obviously there are many challenges for all the world's nations to handle. This is not going to be easy for any nation, but I think that a totalitarian police state is better positioned to deal with it, assuming it goes, full Maoist and just does stupid things like kill all the sparrows and burn pots and pans, smelt them down for iron ore. I think he's a lot smarter than that. You're going to be able to write it more efficiently because you can just do whatever heavy-handed measure you need to stop the hemorrhaging. Whereas given the fact that the United States and Western European countries are, rife with infighting on relatively trivial political issues, something as existential as a population crisis, I can't imagine them coming to any sensible conclusions. And, they would just spend so much time arguing about it. I think that, it can be bad for everyone. But I think that China's current political system, unless that changes in a revolution or something, is better able to do that. China's long game, maybe not be a global power, but certainly a Eurasian power, and restore China's classic position as the dominant power of East Asia via the Silk Road, And in the short term, I think due to demographic pressures, also due to a crisis in the confidence in the PRC, which has promised for decades to reunify with Taiwan, that those pressures might compel the PRC to invade Taiwan at all, in the first place, especially as the United States is distracted in Europe and other parts of the world. Keith, final thoughts?
Yeah, I tend to agree with what some of the geopolitical analysts have said, who have predicted that we may be moving towards what they call a multi-order order. That's a term that Trine Flockhart, she's a Danish specialist in international relations. She's argued that we're moving towards a multi-order order. And of course, Peter Zeihan predicts we're moving back to an era of great power rivalries, similar to what existed before World War One. There's also a meme that's commonly circulated on Facebook, but I think it was originally circulated by someone associated with or influenced by Alexander Dugin's Eurasianism. What the Eurasianists envision is a world of different spheres of influence where there's not a unipolar hegemon. There's not necessarily even a bipolar world order. Instead, they envision sort of a world where different continents are more or less just kind of different orders into themselves, with, of course, the Russia and China dominating Asia, the Asian continent, and then maybe the EU, and then North America, and whatever. And that may very well be the direction we're headed in. It may be that we're fragmenting the world into these kind of multiple orders, rather than this unipolar system like we've had since the end of the Cold War, or rather this bipolar system that existed during the Cold War. Prior to that, the norm was you had large powers in different places that had their own spheres. Of course, they also had their colonial holdings and that kind of thing. So that may be the direction we're headed in at present, particularly if the Asian powers really do create their own parallel financial system that's largely independent of the Western financial system.
All right, Swithun, final thought.
It does seem that they are trying to create their own financial system. I read today that Russia and Iran are trying to create their alternative, the SWIFT banking system, which is a sort of encrypted, I think it's encrypted, sort of communication network between the banking sectors. Iran was kicked off a number of years ago, so they'd be interested with the Russians of getting their own. So the parallel banking sector would be interesting. One thing that just occurred to me, I think would be interesting. China's demographic issue is probably going to be worse than many other countries, not just because of their low birth rate. South Korea actually has a lower birth rate. I think it's now under 1 in South Korea. Replacement birth rate is 2.1. The reason I say it might be worse for China is this. The arguments from, if anyone's come across Ed Dutton, he argues that actually the population decline will actually start to be going to, well, it will decline. They're not going to reverse, basically because the people who have children now are people who are genetically predisposed to having more children. And they will eventually they'll eventually become a greater proportion of the population. So you'll actually get higher birth rates in the long run, because people who are less genetically predisposed to having high birth rates wouldn't have had them, and there'd be no sort of social pressure for them to have done so. So they'll be sort of relatively small proportion of the gene pool. Now, that won't be the case in China, because any people in China who are genetically more predisposed to breed won't, because they have had the one-child policy since like 1980. So they might not have. Whereas the other countries didn't have that. Even the Japanese would have had this to some extent, would have had that sort of kernel of relatively more predisposed, larger families, even in the case of contraception, etc. China won't. So actually thinking about that, which only occurred to me, China's demographic issue could actually end up being worse on that basis, whereas the get out valve to some extent exists for other nations who didn't have that policy.
All right, terminal philosophy.
Yeah, I'll just kind of repeat that same last point. It's just that, if China's going to make a move on Taiwan, it'll have to be sooner than later. And also, yes, I just think that similar to the geopolitics video that you and Keith did a while ago. So I mean, Russia just has this incredibly tall order to fix its society. I mean, so does China, and whatever demographic problems are certainly real in the United States, they're probably twice, if not three times as worse China. So yeah, they have to figure out a way to project a blue water navy. They have to select some sort of well thought out doctrine for its land forces. It needs to figure out its public debt, which is quite abysmal at 300% over its own GDP, and it will have to do something about its demographics. Otherwise, they'll have something like tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, of people that aren't able to be taken care of by their government. So I guess it all remains to be seen.
All right. Thank you, Keith. Swithun, Terminal Philosophy. Always a pleasure. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.